Welcome to part 2 of the chocolate orchid tutorial. In this chapter, we will finish the first layer of color on the chocolate petals and work on the stems. Once everything is dry, we can start working on the definition layer, adding vibrant pink details, a few green accents in the center of our orchids, and a layer of shadows on the stems. In chapter 3, we will work on the final accents. When you're ready, let's get started. So I took a break and I'm coming back on day 2 and I'm gonna work on the remaining chocolate petals and the rest of the petal details that I see, making sure that I cover everything before we move on to the second layer of color. I'm going to start in this area of the front facing orchid using a very light watered down mixture, just kind of framing the orchid lip and that top petal element that covers it. Maybe a little bit of Perylene Violet, not too dark. I don't want it to go to full saturation, just a little bit in the darkest area where it disappears all the way from the view. And then let's see what we have remaining, where we can add some chocolate violet. So perhaps in this area, one of the more intricate folded areas, mostly covered by other elements. It's the base of the petal, if you zoom in on the reference photo, so I will leave a little bit of a strip without any color, as I did on the majority of my chocolate petals. A little bit of Perylene Violet, followed by some magenta, wet into wet, charging it right into that violet. And then there are tiny bits of folded petal that are visible on each side of the segment that we've already painted. I'm gonna add them, but make sure that I leave a little bit of a white strip to indicate that the petal is thick. The part that's facing towards us has some dimension. Another petal base that I left untouched in the first video. I just did the tip, so I'm going to finish it right now. Very lightly, a little bit of violet, then blending with a clean damp brush. I will do the folded segments visible in the background in this area. And don't worry if you omit any of the smaller details. It's really the larger petals that make the composition. So if you can't make sense of some of these smaller elements, I would say simplify and skip them all together. It's not gonna make or break the painting, and simplifying is always a better approach rather than trying to get every single detail and getting lost in these details along the way. So don't fuss if you're missing any of these smaller bits. Now this folded petal, I'm gonna start on the side that's facing towards upper left. Very light at first because I want to make sure that it looks like it's receiving a little bit of light. I'm going to add some Indothrone blue, wet into wet, just because I see a little bit of that cool color in the reference photo, and just a little bit of Perylene Violet, more saturated around the edges and the tip. Not too much. And then continue over another petal that disappears into the background, mostly covered. So I'm going to start very gently with Perylene Violet and then follow with Indothrone blue. And here the blue really is serving one purpose only, and that is to push that element into the background. Maybe a little bit of green gold to warm it up, but for the most part it's like a little bit of a blue segment there as the last element you see moving into the background, so it's the coolest one, the coolest meaning closest to blue. And let's continue. So here you can see why I was skipping some of these details in the first video. I really wanted to make sure that I allow them enough time to dry out. So now I can come back and work out the rest of the segments. Again, notice I'm leaving a little bit of a light strip without any color to indicate the thickness of the petal. So my segment, the one that I painted right now, is not touching all the way. It kind of stops maybe 0.5 millimeter before it reaches the back of the petal. And now one of the larger petals that I've left here, it's facing away from the light, so I think I'm gonna start with fairly saturated perylene violet. You can see it on my palette. It's like medium value. Maybe even add more saturation as I move down. And then of course I'm going to leave the yellowish green, my green gold strip at the base. Very, very defined here, very visible, much easier to kind of read the reference photo and understand all the details. For the most part, I find that once you paint a flower a few times and you really understand how it works in terms of the coloring but also the structure, it becomes a lot easier to improvise and kind of come up with your own composition. So there are certain flowers that I've painted so many times that I can sort of close my eyes and come up with a good painting without the reference. In this case, this is my first time painting a chocolate orchid, so I'm still sort of learning along with you, but I'm now noticing these general principles, and by the time I'm done, I think I'll know enough about this flower to be able to improvise it. There are some elements that I'm still not quite understanding fully, like the top element on top of the orchid lip, but the more I look at the reference photo and the more I paint it, the better I will understand it. And so, you know, they say practice makes perfect, but it also uniquely applies to botanical art, because the more we practice, the more free we feel with our brushes, and after a while you don't even need a reference, and that's sort of the best scenario, where sometimes you just need a quick photo or a quick trip to the garden for an inspiration. Once you know the structure of the flower and you've done it several times, it becomes second nature. But as I said, here I'm learning together with you, learning about the different folds and different ways these petals can be pointing, and just trying to apply the general principles in addition to just mimicking what I see in the reference photo. So here again, I'm gonna start with my perylene violet, and because I know that there's another segment that's closer to me, I'm going to use a little bit of blue to help the bottom of this section kind of disappear or push it back a little bit. On top, I can use a little bit of magenta. So just playing around with cool and warm colors as I'm building these petals and learning about the structure of the flower, but also making sure that what comes out is not flat. So we have a lot of tools at our disposal to avoid creating kind of messy flat pieces where everything blends together. there's always a little bit of logic that we can add and even accentuate, and color temperature is one of the main tools that we use. But of course, values, meaning lights and darks, are always at our disposal, and we have to be mindful. So that's why we vary the saturation. That's why we add our cooler blues in some areas, trying to recreate what we see, but never forgetting about the fundamentals of art. So I think we're getting very close to being done with our chocolate petals. I'm gonna leave the back of this petal until later. I really want the top segment to dry out before I do anything else. I don't want my colors to bleed. So I think I'm gonna wrap this up very soon and move on to the stems and the branches. Maybe some of the smaller elements I can still work on. So here, for example, I've used a little bit of endothroned blue, actually extended it over to the segment of the petal that's furthest away. On the right hand side, where it's sort of facing towards the light a little bit more, I'm going to use magenta and also extend it over, creating the next layer on that segment that I painted before, and simultaneously finishing the last segment that was remaining blank. Maybe I also want to add some definition to this central element right here. It's one of the more complex ones that I see. It's quite light. It's definitely not part of the chocolate petal group, but it's also not vivid pink. It sort of has every color. I'm gonna try very lightly here to mimic what I see in the reference. I know that it kind of stops roughly where the pink petal begins, and there's a warm yellow element on the right. So just very gently, it's just the first layer. I used quite a bit of endothroned blue, but very, very lightly, being very cautious at this stage, just to leave myself some room so I can add more detail later on. I'm gonna come back to this area just to add that last segment, the folded segment. And here I'm not even attempting to leave any white strips. I'm just gonna carry that color over. So this is something that you've seen me do quite a bit in the Sweet Pea tutorial, where I used the overlapping layer technique. The segment was so small that it was much easier for me to just cover it and also cover everything else around it at the same time. So what ends up happening is the segment that was blank acquired a little bit of color and the rest became a little bit darker. And there's no kind of separation between these, but there is difference in value. And for the most part, when there are a lot of overlapping petals like roses or let's say the sweet peas, a lot of overlapping petals of the same color, it's one of my favorite techniques for capturing the level of detail that I want to capture without getting lost. So that last segment was very light and the color was extended over onto surrounding petals, making the surrounding petals a bit darker. a few final touches. There's another petal in the background. I will leave a link to the overlapping layer technique in the video description. It's a large composition featuring sweet peas, and the entire composition is all about overlapping layer technique. It's a really good flower to practice on. Here it just sort of came up once or twice. One last segment, just a folded petal. Here, nothing fancy, just a fold featuring fairly saturated perylene violet. And then I'm gonna leave everything to dry on the flowers, and we're gonna work on the flower stems and the branch. And now let's work on the stems. And I must admit that here my color choices are leaning perhaps more towards a decorative look, more decorative than usual. But I was trying to match the reference photo, and so for the most part, I'm just gonna attempt an underpainting, meaning the first layer that's gonna shine through the subsequent layers, using the colors that I've already used, so blue and magenta. But it might look a bit unnatural to you. So if you want it to look a little bit more subtle, feel free to use warmer, earthier colors. But I went with this purple-blue combo, just adding a little bit of that same perylene violet right now, wet on wet, as a sort of shortcut for brown. And notice that I left a spot right up on top without any color, so that's our highlight, and that's what I see in the reference photo. But I'm trying to recycle my colors, making at least the underpainting look a little bit closer to the petals so that my palette overall is cohesive. In the second layer on the stems, I'm gonna use indigo, and once again there you can use a different dark color that may or may not look more natural for you. It's entirely up to you. The stems are really a supporting element. For me, it just made sense to recycle quite a bit, and so you can see that I've done something very similar on the other segment of the stem, leaving maybe a bit of a smaller area for the highlight, and I wiped my blue with a clean damp brush just to soften the edges. Once again, all of it is going to be covered with a fair amount of indigo on top. But for now, I'm just going to continue building these lighter segments that are going to serve sort of as a base for everything that we're going to add later on. The branch is really thick and juicy, and it sort of has these distinct segments. That's why I'm following that structure. And depending on an angle, the highlights and the undertones change. So that's what we're building right now, just a subtle undertone that mimics the petals. There's a lot of reflection going on because the stems are shiny. And And to me, this makes total sense to have this magenta on the stem, maybe with a little bit of darker underthrown blue. And it's gonna play out really well once I put down my darker, moodier indigo. These colors will shine through without being too overwhelming. So I'm just going segment by segment, trying not to build too much volume at this stage, so not too much variation in lights and darks. But in some areas, I do accentuate the shadows already. Most of the shadow work will happen in the second layer with our indigo. So let's just finish this off, and then we can do that large branch, the thicker branch up on top, the one that supports all these flowers. What I have left before we move forward to the thicker branch is just a few segments that are sort of hidden behind the flowers. And so here I'm not going to be leaving any white spots, so full coverage and maybe slightly more saturated underthrown blue. Very moody, one of my darker blues that I often use for the background. And here as an underpainting, it works a lot better than my typical go-to blue, which is phthalo blue. Phthalos are a lot more vivid, a lot more staining and bright, and I don't need that brightness here. I need sort of a very dull, muted blue. And a little bit of that magenta. It almost starts mixing into violet when I apply it on the branch right after the blue. I might even add a little bit of green there, my green gold, since that's what I see in the reference. And that's it. Now let's move it up a little bit and paint the first layer on the larger branch. A little bit of extra pencil marks that I don't need, I'm gonna erase. And then here, if you've watched any of my previous tutorials, particularly where we have very prominent stems, you may recognize the technique. If not, I will leave a link to my stem tutorial. It's an older one on YouTube. Essentially, we're painting an elongated kind of cone shape, if you will. And I'm gonna first lay down my blue, followed by green. Both colors will meet in the center, leaving a lighter, kind of almost like a highlight, not quite white, but a lighter portion running along the stem. So I just finished the first part, and if they blend too much, if it looks too dark for your light underpainting, you can lift the colors in the center with a clean, damp brush. So we have a bit of a challenge because our reference photo is showing us the stem against a very dark background. Here we have white background, so we do want to make sure that the edges are dark enough so we don't lose the silhouette. So that's why I am playing a little bit with the relative value, meaning how dark I want the edges to be, perhaps making it a bit darker than what I see in the reference. And then while my stem is still wet, I'm gonna drop much more saturated purple right in the center. It could be purple, it could be that same Perylene Violet. The key is it should go in wet on damp, so you don't want it to spread too far. You want kind of like a line, a very soft line in the center. And what that indicates is that the stem is backlit, meaning there's a lot of light coming from the back, and it's lighter around the edges with a little bit of a shadow in the center. So that's what I was trying to attempt by adding darker color in the center. If your surface is too wet and the color is spreading too much, once again you can lift it like I did here with the tip of your brush. Damp, clean brush. Give it another minute and add a little bit more color in the center. This is my kind of typical way of painting stamps that are backlit, creating first a fairly light underpainting, and in this case I'm doing it using very light blue and green gold. You can just use one color, and then adding a darker color, purple or violet. Usually I don't like pure browns, they look kind of boring and dull. In the center, wet into damp. Meaning after the paper had a chance to dry out a little bit. So I will leave a link to the stamp tutorial in the description below, but for now I'm just carrying on, adding a little bit more purple as my paper is still wet, and I can continue building a little bit of that value in the center. You can look at step-by-step photos to see sort of where I've landed. And also in the final step, note that we're going to do exactly the same thing with indigo, or whichever darkest color you decide to go with. Could be even like something like Perylene green, but it's going to be the same thing. A little bit of color around the edges, meeting in the center, and then a thicker, darker line, wet into damp in the center of the stem or branch, if you will. Now I'm gonna come back and finish off that layer on the brown chocolate petals. So here, very simple, I'm just gonna do the back side of this petal. Trying to leave a little bit of a white space, just a very thin line, almost disappearing between this side and the front facing, or the one that's facing up. Just to indicate that the petal has some dimension, it's thick. And then when my Perylene Violet is ready, I can drop a little bit of warmer color. Just clean up the edges. And then see if there are any other sections of the chocolate petals that I need to finish before we can move on to the second layer. Maybe just a little bit more of saturated Perylene Violet just around the edges. And that should be enough. I took a bit of a break here, and you can see it dried out. As usual, it dries out looking a little bit lighter when the water evaporates, which is typical. And now I just have these two petals that I left alone because they were touching other wet segments. So I'm just going to finish them right now. And they appear quite a bit lighter than most. So I'm going to be very, very careful, just adding some Perylene Violet around the edges, making sure that the silhouette is strong. But then I'm blending with a clean damp brush, making that violet disappear even before it reaches the center of the petal. So these two are going to be quite a bit lighter than the rest, and you can see it in the reference photo. You can also see it in my final version. I'm just putting less pigment, really just concentrating on the edges, not letting it spread too far. And then blending, softening that violet, making sure it disappears into the background, leaving quite a bit of that initial green gold, or maybe it was pale yellow. It's hard to say at this stage, but leaving quite a bit of a lighter first layer, quite visible in the center. Must have something to do with the way the petals were facing towards the light in the original reference. The ones that are facing down are quite darker, so this is sort of an interesting exercise in understanding the direction of light. All these petals are quite intricate. So I think that's it for the first layer on the petals and on the branch. Now we can move right into the next stage because the pink petals, orchid lips, had more than enough time to dry out. So let's grab our magenta and add some definition on the pink central petals. So here I'm gonna start with the one on the back, and note there is like a very defined element in the center. It's a bit lighter, so I'm gonna start around that element. Notice that my magenta is now closer to medium value, but I'm not reaching full saturation just yet. I will though in just a minute. I'm gonna blend everything with clear water and then start dropping it more and more saturated magenta, letting it spread. So it's the most saturated part is closer to that light element. This is called negative painting. You may already be well familiar with this technique. I'm painting around that oval-shaped central element, and it suddenly stands out so much more. And now I'm just going to clean up the edges, making sure that I'm letting that magenta spread out evenly. And of course the complicating factor is that this petal is covered by the chocolate petals. So we will need to match this color on the other visible segments. But I'm gonna let everything dry just to see how far it will spread, so then I can match the other segments better. In the meantime, let's do the same thing on this petal right here. Again, I painted around some smaller, lighter elements closer to the base. Then spread that color out. This time I have to go all the way to the edge because I don't want my saturated magenta to stop abruptly. I want to make sure that it runs all the way to the edges. So I'm using clear water right now. And now followed with very, very saturated magenta. And you can see it's spreading very smoothly. I just love how magenta blends. It's so natural and beautiful. And you can play around and add like tiny veins if your paper is still wet. Always in the direction of the petal, always from the base out towards the edge. So notice the positioning of my brush. Doesn't matter what the exact placement of your strokes is. What matters most is the direction of your stroke in this case. You want to always mimic nature in the way you apply color. Think about how the petal grows and unfolds. If it spreads too far, if this is looking way too vibrant, just lift it with a clean damp brush. But I think in this case I was successful in my water ratio, so that was good. I can move on to the next one. And look how much more vibrant and more realistic everything is starting to look now. It's not as flat as the first layer. I absolutely love this part. This is where everything's sort of coming together. So once again, medium value closer to the base, then spread it out with clear water, making sure you go all the way towards the edge. But notice I'm still using my small brush, my size 2. I don't want to use a larger brush here because I don't want too much water on paper, and so size 2 obviously holds very little. I don't like too much water in my second layer. I like more control, so here I go with more saturated magenta, again gently dragging it out in the direction of the petal. There's a little bit more kind of variation, some spots that I see in the reference photo, so play around here. Again, your paper shouldn't be dripping with water, it should be just a little bit wet. So you have some level of control over how far your magenta spreads. And now I'm just going to clean it up a little bit, make sure that everything was covered properly. Maybe even add a little bit more in the center. You can try adding a more vibrant, warmer red, something like quinacridone red, for example. It's a very subtle change. It's going to stand out a little bit more if you add a warmer red that is leaning closer to oranges, or just stick to one magenta here. And now what we have left is just some subtle textures on the central petal, the one that's covering the orchid lip. And again, here I will admit, these are too complex and too nuanced at this scale. It's really hard for me to make sense of the exact logic, so I can't improvise too much. I'm just going to use my magenta to maybe add a little bit of value there. Before I move on to the last orchid lip, and here I'm going to mix in quite a bit of purple into my magenta because that petal is all the way in the background. I want it to look like it's further away so it doesn't stand out as much as the two orchid lips in the front. A little bit on this element as well. Again, it's quite a bit of purple, almost pure purple here. So it's just a subtle shift from magenta to purple, moving along the color spectrum closer to blues. And it looks a little bit cooler, and in that area there's barely any light reaching, so I'm going towards darker, medium to dark values with my purple. And then back to magenta, maybe a couple of lines on this element. Now we have a couple of segments that are visible between the petals that we also need to take care of. So on this side, a little bit of magenta mixed with purple, and then blend them with clear water, trying to match the intensity of the first segment that I painted. And then the other side, closer to the base, again a little bit of magenta purple, leaning closer to purple, and then I'm blending with clear water. Jumping quickly to this side, I'm gonna create some visual separation between these two elements that are covering the orchid lip. And I'm just gonna simplify this process, just a little bit of color on the left, framing the central element, and then I'm just gonna blend with clear water so it just stands out a little bit more. So I wanted to spend a couple of minutes on this rather optional step, but I thought it would add a little bit of extra realism, extra sense of detail. I brought in my olive green and just went over some of those areas, especially the ones that we didn't touch since the underpainting stage, and added a little bit of an extra green touch, if you will, here and there. So started with the stem on the left. And now I'm moving to one of the central orchids, just adding a little bit of a shadow, this olive green shadow, up on top of the central element. And then in some areas, if you look at the reference photo, in some areas it makes sense to add a little bit of that olive green closer to the base of the petals. The petals are not just strictly attached to the center of the flower, they're sort of like disappearing and folding inwards. So there's going to be a little bit of a shadow there, and a more intense green I feel like is warranted. And it's very, very subtle, wet on dry. You can blend it with a clean damp brush to make sure that it gently disappears into the background. So all I'm doing is just building a tiny bit of depth using a more intense green. You can achieve the same thing using that same Perylene Violet. I just found that a little bit extra green would be more natural. In the reference photo, there is a lot of that warm green in the background. I thought it was a welcome addition to kind of break out our violet and magenta hues, bring a little bit of warmth. And so I'm going to do the same thing on this orchid, just a little bit of green around those lighter yellowish elements. I put just a tiny bit and then I blend it out with a clean damp brush. Very gentle strokes, very, very subtle. And now I'm going to reassess again before I work on the stems one more time. Just going to see if there are any areas that could use a little bit of extra value, like for example that area on the petal lip, on the orchid lip. A little bit of color as it disappears behind the branch, and then I'm going to blend it with clear water. Not too far, very, very gentle application here, sticking to medium values. Another small element, again, disappearing into the background. So I'm going to put the shadow where it disappears almost entirely and then blend with a clean damp brush. Couple of extra bits around the tips of the petals where I feel like maybe they're not crisp enough, so I'm just accentuating those little folded elements. and this strange sort of thick petal element on top of the orchid lip. I'm gonna put a little bit of shadow, indicating that it curves up. So again, I'm putting extra value, not too dark, in those areas that are further away, that are more in the shadow. So here I just put it roughly where it folds up, and then I blend it with a clean damp brush all the way to the base. And you would think that this element would be similar, but it's not. I think in addition to shadows, it has a lot of intricate coloring. So once again, here I'm gonna admit defeat and say that I don't quite understand the logic of this petal, so I'm just gonna mimic what I see in the reference photo. I find it's a lot harder to paint when you don't actually understand the form, and here I barely understand the form, so I'm just kind of faking it and following what I see in the reference instead of actually consciously building the form on paper, which is how I prefer to do things. But here it's just a little bit of color where I notice it in the reference photo. The last thing I wanted to work on in this chapter, I apologize if you're hearing that barking dog. We have new neighbors and they have 3 dogs. So we're just gonna have to deal with a little bit of noise, I think, for the next couple of minutes. My apologies. So the last thing I wanted to do is add a little bit more dimension on my stamps. They dried out, and before I go in with my indigo, I just want to build a little bit of value, particularly in the areas where the stems are disappearing into the background, perhaps overlapping, like in this section. So I'm gonna go with much darker dioxazine purple, not covering the entire surface, just the shadow parts, the ones that are really disappearing into the background. So in a way, what I'm doing here is I'm framing the lighter petal elements, building more value and depth on these stamps, and I want eventually to almost reach full saturation. So in the final chapter of this tutorial, I will go even darker. For now, I'm working on top of that initial light underpainting and working section by section, and you can see the step-by-step photos, how it worked out. I'm just adding darker value using purple. You can use that same Indothrone blue. The color, as always, matters less than your tonal value. The main thing here is that I'm using much darker color to kind of help create visual separation between different sections and add a lot of shadow and depth in those areas that I want to be darker than my chocolate petals. And so using dioxazine purple, or like I mentioned, you can use Indothrone blue, is helping us push those elements into the back, because those colors are a lot closer to blue on the spectrum compared to even the most saturated violet petals. And so they will naturally look like they're further away and kind of heavier and darker. Here on this section, I'm gonna start with dioxazine purple, but then maybe still carry it up with a warmer magenta, since the petal itself looks quite light in the reference photo. So I'm adding value, but I'm not just using purple. I'm still using a little bit of magenta in the center to maintain that lighter part. And then I'm going to finish with purple again closer to the base of the flower where the stem meets the petals. there I really want to accentuate the dark. So using medium to dark values, so like maybe somewhere around 7 on the value scale, really trying to shape it. This is very similar to me to sculpting something like a 3D form. Once again, if the color spreads too far, if it's covering your highlights, which is what's happening to me right now, you can lift it gently while it's still wet with a clean damp brush. So you can see as a result, in the end, I have a much darker beginning of that segment and the end with a little bit of a highlight and some warmth in the center. So just a couple more details as I'm moving up and towards the bigger branch up on top. Once again, just using purple and only focusing on the shadow areas that are disappearing behind the petals. Working slowly segment by segment just to add a little bit more definition. Here I'm going to have a thicker shadow up on top, falling from the top stem, and then I'm going to carry it down. Soften the edges with a clean damp brush. And we can pause at this stage. We're almost done. I will see you in the third and final chapter where we will work on some intricate petal veins and add some shadow accents throughout to bring this project to completion. Thank you for watching and painting with me. I will see you in chapter 3.